This is Culture Wang, and we are your hosts, Masha and Tom. As our very first guest on this brand new show, we are joined by Alfie Bown. Unlike my co-host, Alfie Bown is neither an idiot nor a pervert, and yet he has legitimate socialist street cred. He edits Sublation-Mag and Everyday Analysis and writes for Paris Review, Tribune Mag, and others. Of his published works, I've only skimmed In the Event of Laughter, Bloomsbury 2018, a brisk read that uses impotent and disturbingly jowly old Lacan to push a new framework for discussing laughter, which, since I was drinking Dada's homemade Slivovica, was hilarious to me at the time. I'm pleased to be sharing conversational space with two Northerners who take humor so seriously. Welcome to the Wang.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I didn't know it was the first one. That's great. Happy to be
first guest.
First guest, yeah. Great to be here.
Great. So my intention was to discuss another impotent and disturbingly jowly figure, Henry Kissinger. Hopefully we find some laughter in the subject matter. So where to start with Kissinger? I know that Tom's going to want to start with his particular psychosocial, sexual leanings, maybe.
Oh, I want to start that he was at the Battle of the Bulge. So there you go. So he saved the West, basically. I'm half joking, but it's still true. We had this discussion already. Did you notice, Alfie, that he was in the invading forces as a military intelligence guy in Belgium?
I didn't know that. I mean, I was learning a bit about, I've always been sort of aware of him, and I was learning a bit about it this week, but I didn't know that. And have you heard him speak? I mean, he's got quite the voice. I mean, that's the real sort of object of fascination with him, I guess. He's sort of charms people even if they hate him, right? So they're sort of drawn in and repulsed at the same time.
That's a good description. I was hoping that Tom could do an impression because there's a little bit of a German accent, right? But he refuses to even try. I don't know.
I'm not good at those things, but I mean, he has German. He had German ancestry, no?
Yeah, I mean, I learned that today because, the other day when I was thinking about it, it turns out he sort of he had a different name. I forget exactly what it was, but they sort of, so I guess they're German Jewish family, and they fled Germany when he was 15 to kind of escape the Nazis, right? So then emigrated to America and kind of found a home there. So I think that's a fascinating bit of the history there. Because obviously he's sort of known as this, sort of pioneer of what the supporters might call American democracy, or the critics might call sort of imperialist warfare and foreign policy, But it's interesting that actually came originally from coming to America to escape, Germany in the 40s. I do find that interesting.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of realpolitik, which I've clearly probably mispronounced, but I find it interesting that he went back, not to his own hometown, but he was given control after the liberation of a smallish concentration camp. He was given control of the nearby town as a U.S. military intelligence officer, and he being aware that the local population would be watching for retribution, he had his underlings address him as Mr. Henry, I think, rather than by his rank and last name Kissinger, because he didn't want them to know that he was a Jewish man, or think that he was exercising some sort of retributive justice against them. But I think that that's where he picked up his truly, broad and deep and wide love of having control over a population that had been suppressed, had been defeated in some way.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting. The real politics thing, as I understand it, is looking brutally at the numbers and stuff, right? It's interesting that as we're talking about it in this moment. I really don't want to get into Israel Palestine, but it does seem kind of an interesting moment to think about this stuff, because I guess the idea of that is that you can't sort of romanticize and become attached to the narratives and stories. You've got to be brutal. People are going to die. What's going to be the lesser? of the evils here or whatever. And I think like that's kind of what he seemed to stand for, I think. And like this idea that like he sort of claimed that what he was proud of was keeping the superpowers from going to war with each other. So yes, there's all this collateral damage in sort of smaller or lesser areas, but the main tension is kept in hand. That was like kind of his thing, that like foreign policy could do that, whatever. But obviously there's all sorts of problems with that. But it seems to me like, yeah, an interesting moment to be raising that question, because this is how we are consuming the present moment, right? How many thousand of this and how many thousand of that? Is that what matters? What else matters and stuff? So we're obviously grappling with these questions, which I think is interesting.
So what would be, I mean, we're getting into the meat of things right now. And so, I mean, by this point, everybody knows that Kissinger was, a very controversial figure, for obvious reasons. And I'm thinking a lot about, these days about costs and hidden costs of, of policies. And I mean, we're living in the West, and huge part was designed by people like him in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? And, realpolitik was mentioned. The policies, the understanding of who we are as a people, as a European or even American kind of people. And then you have the atrocities, that can be attributed to him. So how do we approach a person like this? So what are the hidden costs in maintaining, a kind of social identity for the West? Because for everything is a cost. It's like, even, I mean, we're approaching Christmas still after 2000 years, and knowingly that, there was also like a huge cost in maintaining that kind of ideology, that kind of religious system. We're still doing it. We're still partaking also in the West. So how do we approach, in your mind, a person like Kissinger?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're getting towards what I guess I would want to say about Kissinger. And as I say, this is really not my topic, but what I did feel was important to say when I was thinking about this history, and I guess this is why I was saying about where it all begins in Nazi Germany or whatever, because I think that basically, if you don't, to put it in one sentence, if you don't get rid of capitalism, you don't change anything. So you got a story here which goes from, he escapes Nazi Germany, and then the idealism of American democracy becomes the value which stops us and saves us from such an atrocity ever occurring again. So in his mind, democracy is the thing that matters. Protecting and saving that means you won't have a crisis like that again. You won't go back to the horrors of which were witnessed there. Where I think he's wrong, and is that we have seen, as you say, just as many costs, just as many horrors inside and because of the American democracy, which was championed from that point on, right? So, and what I think how to solve an issue like that is to sort of bring in this other concept, right, of capitalism or whatever, in my opinion. So basically, what you've got there is someone who threw away one term, or escaped one world in favor of another, but what remains the same is the underlying sort of core structure of society, and that, I guess, is capitalism. And so it's interesting to separate capitalism and democracy in that way. We often think of them sort of synonymously; they mean the same thing, but they don't really. And I think with we're in this case, we need to think of them differently, because what happens if you've got democracy? Well, if you've still got capitalism, you get deaths and inequalities, and there's no point counting them, they're limitless. So I guess that would be my sort of take on the Kissinger story, is that, it maybe starts from a reasonable place, a way of thinking that's how do we get away from and prevent these things happening again. But unfortunately, it leaves intact the very thing which makes those costs of lives and livelihoods so high.
Right. Masha, you want to jump in, or?
I mean, I think that is generous. I think it's a generous interpretation to say that he was concerned about democracy. I think it was more about power. I think his interpretation of realpolitik was that there had to be there had to be like a hegemon, like a very strong power center. And I think that his chief or primary concern was order over chaos. Like he was just obsessed with there being like a really strong hierarchy. And I think that some of the other like one of his innovations, or one of the things that he did, and one of his famous quotes was that we'll do the illegal immediately, the unconstitutional will take a little longer. And one of those illegal things was that he accrued power to himself without accessing any of the proper channels. Like he just did it. He just, decided for himself to take control and take power. So he had sort of designed this series of like bombing runs on Cambodia, Laos, and parts of Vietnam that he called Menu, and there was breakfast, etc. Right, so that to me is more indicative of this kind of like early capitalistic like democracy being replaced with consumer choice. Do you know what I mean? Like there isn't real like sovereignty in the citizen. The power is completely centralized, and the only like democratic choice that we are given is which aspects of that to consume.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, and I absolutely wasn't saying. Sorry, when I said it might have initially began somewhere good, I didn't mean he's well intentioned. I meant when imagine him being 15 years old and a 15-year-old boy escape. From that perspective, I'm sure the chain began somewhere not so unforgivable. Absolutely, I mean it's and I guess that the other reason why I'm not sort of going through. The negative side of stuff is because I think, as you say, we know, I mean, the stuff, it only takes a quick look at Wikipedia or something to see like some of the things. If you look at like the stuff around Cambodia and the kinds of bombings and stuff, we are talking about someone who like actively sanctioned and seems to have played the role as well of like when governments were unsure whether an action was too drastic, he was the one saying, well, let's do it. And as you said, the excuse would be, well, there could be even worse if we don't, sort of thing. This is completely unforgivable, obviously, and does need saying.
So, my bad take on this is that he was just ahead of his time as like a life coach to the powerful. Like, you know what I mean? Like he wasn't really wasn't really himself a figure that wanted to exercise power openly. He was always behind the scenes and always like pushing figures like Nixon and others to like exercise power in the most vicious way.
And this is also, just to sort of kind of go back to what I was saying before, this is also why I think it is interesting to talk about it now, because and this concept of democracy, because when has democracy not been about power and stuff? So it is probably time to do away with the concept, because it clearly is an ideological tool rather than a sort of equal reality or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this. Yeah, there was this famous interview where he freely admitted that he considers himself as a cowboy and likes to do things, on his own. And Nixon was kind of so angry with him that he denied him access to the White House. But the point of it is like this kind of ideology is so much ingrained to the Western ideal of individualism, and as capitalism. And so you have all the benefits, but also the atrocities. And that's the kind of the conundrum that you're stuck, because, I mean, we're sitting here, we are all benefactors of capitalism and individualism and all of these things. And still we have to contend with the dark side and, the atrocities and all of this, the injustices that go with it. And so I was kind of interested how you work for the Sublation, or it's your creation, the Sublation magazine, or you created it, or?
With two other with a few other friends. I mean, basically, the quick story of that is we used to be the team at a company called Zero Books, which is a publishing house, and it was bought by another company, and we were all fired. So we set up our own. Four of us set up our own things. We've got a book publishing, a magazine, and podcast. That's Sublation Media. So there's a group of us who are doing it.
Right, but on the description of the site, it's I hope I cite this correctly, that you say that you try to embody a left that is able to criticize itself, right?
Yes,
because
yeah,
that's one of because that's one of the big issues for me in this kind of culture war that we're in, that the left normally isn't really able to criticize itself because it has to, because the right can't. And the only way forward is for left that is kind of so progressive that it kind of can critique itself. But in that kind of position, how do you approach this kind of conundrums that I was speaking to in terms of capitalism? Because you can't have like a knee-jerk reaction towards capitalism. Oh, that's the big baddie. No, it's like we have to look at it more, precisely, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the most important things the left needs to and doesn't do. And part of it is that we have become, whether it's left or right or whatever, we have become so oppositional that we have come to sort of think that the other is the enemy and that we are not ourselves at all complicit in these things. And actually, this Kissinger death is very emblematic of that. And I mean, I know we said we might talk about humor, which seems like a totally different topic, but actually one of the things that this did connect to, because there was this huge flurry of jokes. You remember when Kissinger died, there was this enormous celebration on the part of all the liberals, leftists, whatever, making all these jokes on Twitter, lots of memes celebrating Kissinger's death or whatever. Now, I'm not against joking about people's death, obviously, from a moral position. Black humor is fantastic, so you can joke about whatever you want. But what is interesting is how people think that they are pure and the other is the enemy. And some of this thinking about the history of great men, it's very easy. Let's blame this person, celebrate their death. It allows you to believe in an illusion of progress or somehow. But of course, Kissinger is a symptom of the fraught, problematic society that is capitalism. And we're all part of that. And we're not pure compared to the others' complicity or guilt. And again, it makes it interesting to talk about with Israel-Palestine, because, you can be as pro-Palestine as you like. I think it's very important to support people who are whose lives are under threat, but at the same time you mustn't fall into this us and them logic where you're just carrying a flag and you think you're the pure subject who's got the right view and the other is the problem. And what we saw in the Trump election and the years surrounding that was everybody on the liberal side thinking all the far right and the fascists were the only enemy, and if only we could get rid of them, everything would be fine. This is the threat, whatever. But actually, that's not the case. We need full, proper social reform, and society needs to be fully reformed, and that includes ourselves, and we're all part of that. We're not pure and separate from it. We're guilty and complicit. So we felt there was a need for a space that was specifically saying, look, yes, we are aligned broadly with a leftist or even Marxist position, but we're not guilty of thinking of ourselves as free of the problem, as activists who aren't part of something, vegans who pour milk in Selfridges and think they're not actually, part of the problems of the world they're in. We want to admit that we are part of it and kind of critique that from within, critique ourselves and our position in it, and so on. So that was what we meant by that. And I think you're right. It does sort of flare up with this in particular when everyone's like, yeah, dead evil person, society improves. It's just nonsense.
You're also complicit. Sorry to just round this up. Complicit also because we still need the system. It's like I mean, I rather live in the West than anywhere else in the world, and there's so much good things. And again, Kissinger was kind of emblematic in designing it that way, and it's weird. That's what I mean.
It is, and the problem is really at that point is really sort of sharply visible in Britain, of course, where because of the history of empire, everyone. I mean, I like being British myself. I mean, I lived away for for the last 5 years and then came back a few years ago, and I like I like England. I think it's a nice place to live. I've lived in Africa and I've lived in China, and I prefer living here. And I think that's fine to say, right? I don't want to have to apologize. Say, well, but what happens is we then start sort of blaming. Yeah, we don't see that. Yeah, we're deeply connected to it. Of course, we want to celebrate. Might want to wave a Palestinian flag, but we don't want to go and live in the Gaza Strip, right? So, it's complicated. It's not a simple case of saying, us and them. I think that is the main thing we sort of struggle with here. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Yeah, I don't know how to solve that one though.
Well, but okay, so two things I wanted to say. One is like the what comes up for me is the like philosophical like underpinnings of these systems. And Kissinger, like, you know, went to university kind of late in his life, and his undergrad thesis basically referenced you know, the decline of the West and a few other Hegel, a few others. You know, these very kind of like these philosophers whose thoughts have been, I think, malappropriated ever since, you know, by various, usually boringly power-hungry people. And then, secondly, this idea that that these Western values can be made durable. I mean, you've both said where you're from and why you appreciate living in the West broadly. I mean, I come from the birthplace of democracy, right? The Balkans, broadly speaking, and I mean, now that whole region is completely, you know, destroyed by technocrats, IMF policies, etc. Right? Like basically, it's gone as that ideological homeland of those values. So, should we talk briefly about sort of like what has happened to like the philosophy of the West, of modernity?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I weirdly, I want to say that my sort of comment on that would be the same as the one about my comment would have been about the jokes and humor, right? So the funniest thing was the trending the Twitter on Twitter or whatever it's called, "He's dead" in capital letters was trending. Now that is quite funny. I do find that quite funny, but I think what it boils down to is a kind of castration complex or whatever, right? So we get pleasure from castrating the old masters, and we like to think that this is somehow liberating or something, but often it's not. You know, a lot of this happens with, I mean, this would be very interesting to apply to like the Me Too movement as well, and also to like girl boss culture, which is a form of castrating the old masters and assuming that the new ones will be somehow better. So it's sort of celebrated as this thing, this sort of move forward. And I think we see the same with philosophy, this kind of desire to like sort of say, well, you know, Hegel was a patriarch, or, you know, this sort of thing. Freud was a patriarch, or Hegel was a racist, or whatever. Like that is nonsense. I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, as you say. They can be used in various ways. They can be used for ill. They can be used for good. Philosophy has that aspect to it. It can be done. It has been done with Heidegger. You know, Nietzsche is a great example, who has served extremely interesting leftist causes and right-wing ones. You know, and it's not that you can say what you like, it's all interpretation. It's just that, you know, ideas do sort of get, you know, retroactively changed over time and so on. So I think it's really silly to take this attitude to philosophy, well, like, that one was a bad guy. You know, there is a new book actually about why the left shouldn't read Nietzsche or whatever. I just think that's the stupidest idea ever. But what it all boils down to is this thing: we love to have this castration fantasy where it feels pleasurable to chop the head off or castrate an old master, because of course maybe they deserved it, but it doesn't necessarily follow that we're liberated from the system, or that the new masters are any better, or something like that.
Yeah, and again, Marsha and I, we already had this discussion. What makes the West so special is that we, with Enlightenment and secularism, humanism and democracy, that we kind of developed like an autoimmune, you know, system that helps us to be critical of the things that we are ourselves producing. And, you know, because you mentioned, you know, the conflict at the, you know, in Gaza and between Israel and so when I look at, you know, these kinds of other systems that don't have had the Enlightenment in the way the West had, they don't have this immune system that enables them to curtail what they're doing themselves. You know, so imagine Germany, to be more precise, imagine Germany would go to Denmark on a regular basis and kill the people there from whatever ideological reasons. So Germany would be very fast to, you know, excuse themselves and would do everything that doesn't happen anymore. And so that, you know, this autoimmune system, that it can react to itself. So we are kind of critical of what Kissinger did, and we are very critical of the last 70 years of what America did in general. And this is, in a way, it's a healthy sign. It's a healthy mechanism that is not, you know, taken, you know, so easily for granted for the whole globe. It's like the whole globe is still full of dictators and people that oppress other people, and that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's exactly how I felt about when they were sort of putting statues in the river or whatever. You know, there was that moment where there's taking down statues and stuff. It's not that, like, I think it shows, as you say, it shows a certain kind of shift in consciousness where, you know, certain aspects of history are not emphasized and in the same way as they were. And that shows like a shifting public consciousness around certain things, which could be good. Right. But then when it sort of ends up with this sort of like tearing down a statue type symbolism, I don't know. It feels like the point's kind of been missed.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I don't know. It's yeah, it is interesting. I mean, because that is what this Kissinger death was experienced like, actually, very similar to those statues getting pulled down or whatever.
What's interesting is that Kissinger was not a left or right figure during his time. Like he actually, his kind of home was more the Democrat Party in the US, right? Like he did work under Nixon and then under Johnson, but like he moved between those parties, but more so he, in his later years, he sort of like shoulder tapped the Clintons as his like kind of ideological successors, yeah. And so it's completely bizarre to me that sort of this identitarian left is trying to not just castrate his memory or like that idea of the centralization of power. I think he's in his lifetime he possibly tried to place himself as like a modern philosopher of power. You know, I think he borrowed a lot from Nietzsche and others and tried to, but I mean the banality of his analysis is what ultimately was uninteresting. But in any case, I think it becomes more of this identity issue than anything else. Like they're missing the entire point, because power doesn't care whether you're wearing red or blue, a MAGA hat or a pussy hat or whatever. It'll move where it moves, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I remember he reminded me, I wanted to say something similar about this, how he seemed to have, from my very limited, reading about it this week, he seemed to have this odd ability to speak to both the Democrats and the Republicans or whatever. And the weird thing is the people, I would say, I mean, this is a generalization, obviously, and, but, I got a broad sense of who's who on the internet. The people that are sort of, were all sort of jumping out, celebrating his death, were actually more like the Democrats, the DSA and the Democrat type Americans, not the sort of communist or Marxist or far left or whatever. So it was weird, because it's precisely because the lesson surely should be, how was he able to speak so much to these things? Surely that shows us, as you say, there's very little difference between these things. We're getting often bogged down into, completely arbitrary choices. I mean, in the UK here, we've got the best ever moment of this, but where we've got to choose between Keir Starmer's Labour Party and Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party. Now, there literally is no difference in, so this sort of moment does kind of show, well, actually, you can see there, this is the structure of this history of power. And to think about it in terms of the left and right isn't helpful. So I totally agree with that. I think it's important to say that, yeah, surely the lesson we should take from this is, if you want to change things, it's not going to be through those historic parties of power.
So how was his death treated in British media? Because in German media, in the mainstream media, there was basically zero mentioning of his alleged war crimes, or more or less proven war crimes. And it was just a celebration of this big political figure. And, if you wanted to, get, into Laos or Cambodia or all these kind of things in Vietnam, you had to, look at, different and more, marginalized, magazines or outlets or podcasts. So how was it in Britain?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as I say, I think Britain, I think this is the point I didn't quite get across before, but Britain gets a lot of pleasure or jouissance, or in psychoanalytic terms, out of talking about its own and America's atrocities and war crimes and things like that. It's something why the Iraq War is very interesting to people, because we admit obviously that we've played a very I mean, I guess it's probably similar in with the US and Vietnam, but there is also a kind of a pleasure in sort of, returning to that topic, and it is obviously fair enough. But I think so. I think the coverage here was pretty much half of what you've said, and then also, but there was always like pivotal and divisive figure who's often, our media have this knack of doing it. Like they'll say the facts are, he did these impressive things, and it's also said that he did these bad things, or widely considered, so, but he sort of does it in this way. And yeah, I mean, but look, I mean, I guess what it comes down to, it's not so complicated, right? Because if you believe that over the last 70 years, America has maintained peace in the world, then he is the symbol of peace and achievements in doing so. Obviously, we don't think that, so he is the symbol of something else. So,
right.
So and I guess those things were the way it was. I guess I'd say, in fairness, the way it was received here was at least acknowledging those kind of different positions on it. My problem, as I've sort of been trying to say, is both of those views are quite sort of oppositional. Both of them fall into these kind of good guys and bad guys, the BBC saying what a fantastic achievements he did, and people saying, yeah, fantastic, he's dead. They're both actually doing the same thing,
right.
in sort of saying, well, we're on the right side of history here.
Oh, that phrase, the right side of history. My God. That makes me break out in hives. I think that one of the things that is interesting to me about him is, and one of the things that gets put on both the achievement list and the what a monster list for him, is that he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. After he extended the war in Vietnam by at least 5 years through his actions, like directly, personally. He then eventually accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for engineering the ceasefire that led to the peace. The Vietnamese part of that bargaining team declined to accept his prize, but Kissinger did show up and collect his, which is amazing to me. Now, Alfred Nobel himself endowed the prize after his brother died in the late 1800s, but the papers thought it was him, and then published, he got to read his own press, how he would be memorialized after his death, basically. And it was terrible because he was a chemist, and he had a bunch of patents for explosives. So
didn't
basically,
the dynamite or something.
Yes, Alfred Nobel, and other armaments, bombs, etc. So I think that's a fascinating parallel. That there's this,
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this idea, what we were saying before, about the idea of history as being something to do with great men. Because what's actually happening there is, I mean, looks like we're on the one hand, you can say the main thing is, you're celebrating certain people who are on the certain side of history in order to sort of draw a sort of lineage which is ideologically on your side or whatever. I'd say more importantly than that, it encourages you to think about history as in a non-materialist way, in a non-structural way, that history and events are the effects of men, and people are the cause, and the events are the effects. The actual facts are that we are the symptoms of history. That men are that people are often the effects, not the cause, right? So, and the history should be seen structurally. It produces people and produces things and events rather than the other way around. And I think that's the most ideological thing that's happening there. It is interesting. I did read a quote when he'd been asked if he regretted anything when he was like 99, and he said something like, I did what I was capable of at the time. Right. So, it's interesting because we have this reparations discourse and retrospectively punishing people for war crimes loads of times. Now, it's really complicated because I don't really know what I think. But on the one hand, obviously, it sounds bad to be able to say, well, that's the best I was capable of at the time, because, well, you might be a racist, fascist murderer, but that's the best you were capable of at the time. But on the other hand, that is the best you were capable of. If you were brought up in a fascist state and you were from age 2 put into these institutions that trained you what to think or whatever, are you then guilty and need to be paying the price 50 years later? Or are you a symptom of the conditions in which you were brought up or whatever? So it's actually a very interesting and complicated question. And I guess I'd be on the side, of saying that, history is nothing to do with great men or great people. We should see it as everyone as a symptom of a sort of structural systems. And the problem with, exactly the same I've been saying throughout. Why can't we celebrate his death? Because the structure is still there. It's just one.
But can't it be both?
It can. I mean, it is both. It is both, of course. It's
because the whole discussion on what you're telling about, speaking about, reminds me of this new book from Sapolsky, Robert Sapolsky. If there's free will and stuff, and so he's like a materialist, says that everything is determinism, everything is causality. There's no, within the machinery of the mind and the social machinery, there's no free will. But then if you approach that philosophically, you can have only one idea if you have the other one. Determinism makes only sense as a concept when you have indeterminate. And so it's the same thing. It's like if we are, if we are the result of history, or the history is result of us, the ideas are complementary. And they can't...
Well, it's a sort of a dialectical relationship, right, or whatever. But when we abstract certain individuals, because the reason why somebody becomes a Napoleon or whatever is not because they were the best of the bunch, it's because the correct combination of symptoms happen to constellate on that space where that person was or whatever. So people have free will, and Kissinger made some poor decisions, but the reason the bigger problem or the bigger, right, is
exactly.
And I think systems promote and groom people that will continue to expand them as well, right? So someone like him rose through the ranks very, very quickly, both in the military and then later in university and then in the political scheme, because he was, I think, the right man at the right place in the right time. Now, he himself insisted that his early experiences of a rising fascist party, the brown shirts beating up workers in his hometown, him and his classmates being chased by Hitler-Jugend, that has nothing to do with his later. Like he said, that it didn't affect him at all, not emotionally, not psychologically, not ideologically. So I mean, obviously. Unlikely, but insofar
when someone says that, it's the opposite,
right? I mean, usually,
but that's very interesting. No, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, but it's the moment when you lean into it, and the system is kind of rewarding what you're doing, and history is kind of rewarding, and you get more extreme, when you get into this evolutionary drift thought, that I think he had to start somewhere, and then history and culture was reacting positively to his leanings and his character. And
I mean, it's one thing that I don't. I'm sorry to say something I know nothing about, but I'm going to anyway. But I think there's something interesting in what Masha was touching on about all the use of philosophy and stuff. And there's this guy in Russia, Alexander Dugin. I don't know if you've read about it. I just have a friend who was writing and stuff. Actually, we're publishing a little pamphlet in Sublation about him, and he plays this interesting role of like a political advisor for Putin, but also a philosopher, and how that works. And it's interesting to sort of see this figure, the contemporary version of this weird sort of very obviously state sort of oriented ideological figure, but also a philosopher or whatever. And I wonder whether, you know, Russia's just having its moment that America had with Kissinger. I don't know, or whether these figures continue in the West. I don't know, but it is interesting that there seems to be this, you know, it's as you say, it's someone who's adept at misreading Nietzsche or something. There's a certain role that.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts about Dugin.
I remember one last example was I read that the Israel. This was way before the current crisis, but I read that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, were reading Deleuze and Guattari. No, that's just a crazy. I mean, like. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, you go.
Not so crazy, I don't think. Honestly, I think that if you dig into who's reading what, I mean, but again, all of those ideas can be repurposed in ways that potentially the originators of them had no intention. But for Dugin, it didn't help that they blew up his daughter, right? So and then that's another kind of like coalescing moment. But why I don't think that he's a Russian Kissinger is the really deep differences between the U.S. and Russia, and also something that I had wanted to bring up about the Palestine conflict and others, the especially the Anglosphere West, that portion of the West, what it is not is any kind of ethno-state. Like it's extremely multicultural, right? Because it's attracted over many generations. You know, it's comprised, you know, completely of very, especially the U.S. Of you know, ethnocultural groups that are not sometimes not terribly compatible, and then create some sort of materia out of that. But Russia has really a deep sort of like a cultural entity of itself, like a cultural idea, which has been rising, a kind of like patriotic nationalism based upon what they've lost in previous wars, right? So they have the March of the Immortal Legion. That's their, you know, every man, woman, and child marches in the streets with portraits of their beloved and honored dead, from the great war of the homeland, which for them was the Second World War, where they liberated themselves, right? So that's a completely different, to me, both grounding, because Dugin is Russian, whereas Kissinger was not American, and a different intention, etc. And yeah, different different field of play.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I know, yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't know anything about it, but I mean, that is very interesting. It does seem like something quite different. Yeah. No, it's okay. Yeah. So, I mean, right. And in the Balkans, these things are presumably consumed with a sort of a dose of both.
Right. Well, I mean, the Balkan spirit it's become very kind of I don't know, like everything is fake. Everything that comes out of the West is probably propaganda. Everything is a big lie. Don't, you know, that's kind of the.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I found it really interesting. I'd love to know more about the history and stuff. We were just in Belgrade. I've never been to Russia, and I would like to, but Belgrade. It's very interesting, because then they think they've also recently got a sort of kind of right-wing government in, right?
Well,
but they're also experiencing the same. Like there's the so-called lefties have just become sort of the same sort of thing. You know, they've sort of gone like that.
Yeah, if you want to know about Belgrade and about Serbia, you should go to Kalemegdan, which is the park at the top of the hill that was an ancient fortress. And there's a tiny church chapel there where every piece of decoration, every piece of furniture, every candelabra is made from old armaments, either from
Oh my God.
cannon shells or yes.
Oh man, I wish I'd known, because we went to that park but didn't go inside didn't go into the chapel there.
There you go. Yeah. So
Oh,
these are cultures, civilizations that are made by struggle, war, like perpetual war for that part of the world where Byzantine Christianity meets Islam meets, you know what I mean? Like there's just this constant fracture and animosity and enmity and war. So,
but
yeah.
are people as like, if I can ask you a question about that, are people as like as oppositional in this kind of simple way that you see here? I mean, they are, because I wonder whether like sort of proximity. I mean, I guess it's not the case in Israel or the Gaza Strip, but I wondered whether in Northern Ireland, for example, where there's this kind of real history of like long-term conflicts and fighting, which used to be very oppositional. They've now sort of gone through that a bit, and they've become way less inclined to be. I mean, this is a bit of a generalization, but I'd say they're less inclined to be far right, and they're also less inclined to be liberal woke. They sort of tend to be less oppositional because they've sort of come through a history of that. So I wondered whether one gets that in the Balkans or not. I don't know, or whether they're just as oppositional as America. I don't know.
I think it depends. It depends on who you talk to and which generation. Like the generations that lived through the illegal bombings by NATO of civilian targets, like the waterworks, for an example, and passenger trains and so forth, pretty much will always see America and that part of the Western hegemony as just patently evil, as something that there's no goodness there for us, right? But others, a newer generation, want to participate in the opportunities that they see, kind of not quite offered, but they see some kind of like streets paved with gold still that was the mythology under the socialist system, right?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah, okay. I guess the ideology is powerful, and it's charms people into taking these positions. So it does its job very well.
Yeah, and I think that if there's a unity, like culturally, ethnically, in terms of religious practice, etc., then it's a different creature altogether. Which is what I do think you see in in Gaza, in the current conflict between Palestine and Israel. It's two really like internally cohesive states that are basically ethno-states, that there's no bringing them together, I don't think. And that really historically and as a matter of course and survival dehumanize each other at base. So I don't see a solution there. I don't know if even Kissinger could solve that. And in his last days, after I think sometime in mid-October, after the first incursion into Israel from Gaza, he had given an interview, and he at that time said that Israel had a right to defend itself. So,
right, interesting. Now I'd love to go back and and think more about this stuff. Yeah. Where are you actually from?
So I was born in Slovenia.
Oh, I've also been there many times.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like a beautiful, genteel, fairly kind of like Austrian influenced, more so. Yeah.
I mean,
I'm sorry to interrupt, because it's limited time, and I would like to ask, like
serious stuff, not just.
No, you're from your point of view. If you look at the political landscape in Europe and how it's developing right now, from your viewpoint, there are lots of right-wing parties coming to power, and we were talking about capitalism, and you have, for example, the left and the Green Party in Germany that completely sold out to capitalism, and trying to find an identity, like how is it in Britain at the moment, and like how do you look at the political landscapes in Europe at the moment?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I'd say it's we've touched on some of what my position would be about this, but I think and I'll start with this. Sort of sounds more sort of edgy than I mean it, but I think the Trump years represented a much better window for opportunity than the present years do. And I think that here it's uncontroversial to say in the UK, because we saw this sort of rise of Jeremy Corbyn as an idea, and this started a sort of bit more of a grassroots movement where people thought, okay, maybe we can conceive of a left actually being part of the political establishment. Maybe you could say some similar things about Bernie, although I think Bernie was way more in the democratic establishment than Jeremy Corbyn is. But these seemed like a moment. There was also Mélenchon in France. That it seemed to me like a moment where, capitalist realism or whatever was kind of the establishment was cracking up, and it's just that Trump was the first to sort of jump in, and it felt like an opportunity, I suppose. And there was a lot of energy among the left, I think, to sort of think about politics, whether that's party politics or not, but politics, and to sort of fight for something there. Contrasting that to this moment, and it's interesting, of course, the way the centre, let's call it, got its hold back was to present the threat of fascism as extremely dangerous, and to encourage us to realign with the centre, to join forces against the rising threat of fascism. So we did that, not myself, but we did. And we now still have the fascism, but we don't have the left. So it's an interesting bit of history that's happened over the last few years, and quite a depressing one. And I think this is also why people want to wave a Palestine flag, or go on a march that's to do with gender or sexuality or culture war stuff. And I'm not criticizing those things. I think that we should show solidarity with causes we believe in, depending on, we might believe in different causes, but that's a good thing. But I think it's also a symptom of the fact that we don't have a political place to channel our energy at the moment. So we're trying, and that's why we're getting sucked into culture wars, identity politics, celebrating the death of castrated old masters, because we precisely don't have a place to put our political energy inside or outside of parties. And so I don't know. I hope I hope that the continued existence of right-wing parties across Europe means that the left-wing parties will be back, and that the current establishment will continue to crack, because the lesson, I think, is that aligning with the capitalist centrists does nothing for you and your economic well-being and rights, and it does nothing to get rid of fascism either.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, it is the left in Germany that completely sold out and left all the good values of the left, and reducing poverty and all this stuff, pro ecology and anti-war. All these kind of values are completely out of the window in favor of, we are in power now, and we finally, after 30-40 years, we can partake in policy making, but it's a kind of weird place now, at least from my point of view.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree. And it's one thing is, it is interesting to talk about the differences in the Balkans and the UK and the US, but what's often striking is how the patterns are comparable, at least. And I think we are seeing these things wherever we look.
Yeah, we're seeing, I mean, I'll say that, and I want to ask you, this idea that the left has basically abandoned populism as a strategy, like abandoned the working class, abandoned real materialist basis for real working class solidarity or any kind of solidarity, like to become more championing of identitarian causes. And I think that I see that as being really kind of wrapped up also in that internationalism. So can we talk a bit about that? Yeah,
I mean, I guess, you probably have cleverer things to say than I, but what I would say is that, do you guys have in your respective countries these silly right-wing TV channels, media outlets that started up in recent years? I guess you got it with Breitbart and the ban and stuff. Here we've got GB News and Talk TV. Do you have equivalents where you are, like sort of more right-wing populist TV media outlets on YouTube and stuff. Because I mean,
Germany has a good immune system again. You know, it's like in Germany, it's no, you haven't.
You've been slapped down too many times. What about Spain?
Well, I mean, you have Vox and you have the ultra nationalists, you know, and Spain has a problem of its own. You know, if you look at it, you know, they're even contentious if there's a democracy, and I mean it is, but there are so many people who are right or even far right and are not very happy with the current policies of Pedro Sanchez and, you know, his movements and his maneuvers. So I think there was just like 1 million people in Madrid, like, you know, going in a demonstration. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I saw that. No, but anyway, my very quick point was just simply going to be, I think, as Masha was saying, the reason why we hate, if you speak to some liberals and leftists in the UK and you say, you know, they love saying, oh, it's bloody evil, talk TV is so fascist, it's brainwashing everyone. And you get it in America, you know, when you had it with Fox, and then you had it with Breitbart or whatever. Then you had it with all these alt-right channels. They're you know, but the reason why the liberals, the left, feels so strongly repulsed by the existence of these things is because it cuts to the core of the fact that they themselves have let the workers down, do not have a language with which to speak to the ordinary average worker, don't have any policies which speak directly to their rights or interests. So, you know, I'm not agreeing with the things that you see on those media outlets, but the left's disgust at their existence is because it knows it's itself fucked up.
It's also so weird. I mean, it's always a topic for me of interest because, I mean, America and Europe are so different. Really. And I mean, it's like this, there's this saying from Marshall McLuhan that if you think that, you know, media and politics and entertainment are not deeply intertwined, you know, neither something about politics nor entertainment. Now, that's such an American thing. And you know, it's like how we approach politics and the left and the right is completely different of how the Americans do it. Like what is for them, I said this in another point, what for them is like kind of leftist is for like a German perspective, like center right, whatever. It's like, you know, you can't really layer these kinds of perspectives perfectly to each other. And it's very different to engage, you know, in a European way with these American ideas without acknowledging that it's completely different systems after all.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And that goes back to the what is the point of critiquing the left from the left or whatever, which, you know, people, the one thing I always get sort of what's the word, sort of comeback on that is people saying, well, shouldn't you be having solidarity with the left, not criticizing them? This is a time when we need to build solidarity. But it is precisely being able to criticize yourselves is what allows you to have solidarity universally with everyone. You know, we're all people, we're all complicit. So without criticizing and looking at ourselves and our role in these things, we don't have a hope of a universalist politics that can speak to anyone other than our little identitarian group on Twitter or whatever it is.
Yeah, the left has become so enamored with purity politics and with gatekeeping and boundary guarding, and it's become this kind of like defeatist, like self-defeating, scarcity mentality, right? Like, oh, there's only so much for us, so we have to keep out those that aren't proper leftists, that aren't doing leftism like correctly or something, you know. And yeah, that enduring just total despising of the actual working classes, of the actual 99% or whatever the discourse is in whatever country we're speaking about.
Yeah.
So if you felt that being like squeezed out of the the divine light of like leftist inner circle kind of elitism, have you been censured by sort of prominent leftists?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, there are unfortunately some individuals at the sort of mainstream leftist publications. I don't want to like play their game and call them out because, but there have been some who are just. But I think generally it comes down to, and maybe I'm being too generous to people who are just knobs, but my feeling is, the economy is getting tighter and tighter. Everyone's more and more precarious, and people become desperate to cling on to their spaces and the little bit of power that they have, because that's the only, recognition is so scarce. And if they welcome in new voices and new things, that recognition goes somewhere else. So I sort of feel like even when people are being real asses about it, they're sort of doing so out of the fact that we live in a declining economy and a declining society that doesn't give people the recognition they need to sort of function and so on. But still, we do need to stop doing it and not go for that purity culture. Otherwise, we'll never get out of it and we'll never improve things.
Marsha, you want have one last question before we let Alfie go, or?
Alfie, do you have a little more time for us, or?
Yeah. I've got to pick up my daughter, but not for the next 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, my last thing I wanted to talk about was Kissinger's sex appeal.
Oh yeah.
We can.
Yeah. Well,
let's go for the sex appeal. Let's go right.
Yeah. I didn't know about that. So again, but when I started listening to a few podcasts about Kissinger to sort of make sure, I was on the right, I had something interesting to think about it. And this kept coming up, that there's this weird sort of, almost sort of, I don't know what's the word, sort of sadistic, masochistic desire to make him into this sex symbol. But what's the history of all that? Where's that come from?
Oh, I mean, he dated several models, and I don't have the names now, but he liked to be seen with beautiful women, and when he was asked about that, he's quoted as saying, "Power is the best aphrodisiac." Now, one of the beautiful women he dated later was asked about him, and she said that they never consummated their relationship. That he took her out a lot, and he listened to her very carefully, and he was always a very good mentor, but that he never had time to sort of actually do anything about the long seduction that he had subjected her to. And so I think that he became known as a figure among women that was safe, that was going to be like a father figure to sort of, give them room and space and time to just kind of, to be heard and to develop themselves, sort of more intellectually.
That's crazy. I mean, it makes him the sort of reverse of what's the Fox News guy called? Roger Ailes.
Yes, yeah.
Like completely horribly abusing everyone in private sexually, and then publicly not wanting to be seen with women and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
same with Steve Bannon, basically, because Steve Bannon is he appears and he looks and he acts like a wild animal. And I wouldn't dare to look at his sex life. I would just rather kill myself, I think.
And then that director
kind of asexual to me. That's the point. Maybe he has some Machiavellian kind of dick problems, so you had to
and the physiognomy there is very similar. Like those men, to me, in terms of their the physical characteristics are really similar. So is that something that gives rise, the eroticization of power? Does that make you look like a weird fat gremlin, or
are you just saying
being a weird fat gremlin make you eroticize power because that's all you can access?
I think you just think all old men look the same.
maybe.
But it is interesting to raise, the quote you gave, there's nothing more erotic than power or whatever, I mean, I sort of think that's true in a sort of, not in a sense of the sort of cliched sense of success is attractive, but although there is that, but from a Freudian psychoanalytic position, you can't separate sex and power. Whereas one of the things that contemporary liberal culture seems to think is that you can, right? And that, relationships shouldn't be a power relation, for example, but there is no relation that it has, that for desire to exist in a certain sense, it could be a tiny pathetic man with a powerful attractive woman, or vice versa. But there's always power dynamics, and we won't sort of solve the questions of sex until we admit that at least. So it kind of does touch on something interesting.
That's a very interesting question, because, you know, to close this up, you know, I was always thinking there's this, you know, intention in our culture to have like a politically correct artist. You know, like an artist should have been transgressive in his personal life, and he should be clean, you know. And now we have, you know, this Me Too movement that shows, oh no, lots of artists are pricks and animals, you know. And so, but there's like this weird conundrum again that you can't have great art, you can't separate that from sex and power and all of this. You need the libido, you need the transgressive element to create something new. Otherwise, you wouldn't create something new. You need the impetus, and in a way, it's like, can you even think like that kind of high strata politician without you know, being transgressive itself? It's like, you know.
Yeah, I do. And to tie the whole thing together a little bit, when you say, you know, relationships shouldn't be about power, what you're actually doing is a kind of castration thing, saying this was wrong. And so it is, in fact, an act of power to say that, or to punish someone for having an impact, to punish someone for having power imbalance is an act of, you know, desirable castrate. It's a sexual act itself of power. So it's all sort of messed up there. And
a formative contradiction, yes. Yeah, exactly.
Bravo.